Okay, so we want to go ahead and get things started. Thanks for being so patient. I guess you all know, we have Brother Lawrence Otis Graham here today, and he's the author of a number of books. The two most prominent probably are Member of the Club and also Our Kind of People, which I'm sure you're all here to hear him talk about tonight. I want to give you a brief bio on Mr. Graham. Lawrence Otis Graham is a nationally known attorney and commentator on race, politics, and class in America. A contributing editor at U.S. News and World Report, he is the author of 12 other books, including Member of the Club and Proversity, Getting Past Face Value, as well as articles in the New York Times, Essence, and Glamour. A graduate of Princeton and Harvard Law School, Graham is best known for appearing on the cover of New York Magazine after leaving his Manhattan law firm and going undercover as a busboy at a discriminatory country club in Greenwich, Connecticut. He also appeared on the cover for his story, Harlem on My Mind. In addition to teaching African American studies at Fordham University and American government at Dutchess Community College, Graham has worked at the White House and Ford Foundation. He is active with the Council on Foreign Relations, Council on Economic Priorities, Westchester Holocaust Commission, Urban League, Boy Scouts, Red Cross, NAACP, and Rotary International, an alumnus of Jack and Jill, the son of a Link, and a member of the Boule. Graham is uniquely qualified to write about the black upper class. His wife, Pamela Thomas Graham, is a management consultant and the author of the Ivy League Mystery Series. She is a graduate of Harvard, Harvard Business School, and Harvard Law School. They have a son and live in Westchester County, New York. So without further ado, we want to bring up Brother Lawrence Otis Graham.
Thank you very much. So we're on? We're on, okay. Okay.
Wow. Just turn it off here. And just you can actually plug that in. Tap
Okay.
To your,
I don't want to electrocute myself.
then you can,
Okay.
put this to you right there. Turn it off for you. There you go.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank Caribou Books for inviting me this evening, and I want to thank all of you for giving up this evening to join me in this dialogue. As Simba said, I'm going to be talking about my book, Our Kind of People, Inside America's Black Upper Class. And I also want to welcome all of you to ask any questions or to comment on any of the things that I am speaking about this evening, because I just want to give you a little bit of background about what the book is about, why I wrote it, and also to address some of the controversy that has come out of the discussion of class within the black community, and also talk about what is the responsibility of the black upper class in the larger black community, and also what has their role been in the past, historically, and also in the recent past. As you heard, just a little bit of background, I grew up in Westchester County in New York, and right now my wife and I live in the great town of Chappaqua, which is suddenly on the map now that the Clintons have moved to our town. But I basically should start off by telling you a little bit about why I wrote this book, Our Kind of People. The reason why I wrote it is because a mentor of mine, someone that probably many of you have heard about or read about, even if you did not know him while he was living, was Reginald Lewis, who was a mentor of mine when I was in law school. And Mr. Lewis had gone to Harvard Law School several years before me, but you probably remember that he had owned McCall's Patterns, the sewing pattern company, and then became the first black billionaire in this country when he had purchased Beatrice Foods, the international food company, in the 80s. And he was someone who I often would call for school advice and for career advice. And one day, when I was a second-year student in law school, I called him to ask him for something, and then he interrupted the conversation. He says, well, I need to ask you for a favor. I said, well, what's that? He said, well, I need advice on raising my daughters. And I said, well, I'm 23 and I don't have any kids yet, and I'm not even married yet. How can I give you advice on raising your daughters? He said, well, come to New York and I will ask you what I need to ask you. So he sent his plane up to Boston and flew me down to New York. And I've never met anybody who had their own plane, but he flew this plane up there and brought me down to his office on Wall Street. And he said, I need to ask you about how to raise my daughters to feel welcomed within the black community. And I said, well, what's the issue? He said, well, we live on Fifth Avenue in a duplex apartment. We have a home in East Hampton, in the summer resort outside of New York City. And we have a home in Paris. And my daughters go to predominantly white private schools in New York. And we're trying to figure out how to introduce them to other black kids who are not going to ostracize them for living what others call a non-black life. And he said that I know that you have lived around well-to-do blacks and well-to-do whites, but yet feel very comfortable in any setting, whether people are well-to-do or not, black or white. And I want to know, what experiences did you have as a child that allowed you to feel that way? So I started to tell him about organizations that would be welcoming of his children. I told him about Jack and Jill, which had been formed in the 1930s, initially for the children of well-to-do black families. I told him about Oak Bluff's Martha's Vineyard, a summer resort where blacks have been going since the turn of the century. I told him about Highland Beach, which I know many of you in the Washington area know about, which was founded by African Americans, about Sag Harbor, another resort in the Hamptons that many affluent African Americans have been going to. And I also told him about the various social organizations and sororities, like the AKAs and the Deltas, that sponsored cotillions that his daughters, once they got older, might want to participate in. So he was writing all this down, and he said, you know, this would make a great book. And I said, well, I really don't think so, because anybody who cares about it is already participating in these organizations, and folks that don't know about it don't need to know about it because it's kind of beside the point. And he said, well, I think that it would be extremely helpful and as a part of American history. So that's why I started researching the book. And I spent 6 years doing that and looking into not just the old families, because my intent was to profile 12 different cities, to look at Washington, Atlanta, which are probably two of the most prominent of the cities that have historic black elite families in these organizations and schools. I went to look at the colleges like Howard and Morehouse and Spelman and Fisk, as well as the different other social organizations like the Lynx, that was founded in the 1940s for black women, and the Girlfriends and the Guardsmen and the Boulay, various organizations for men. And to look at the fraternities like the Alphas and the Kappas and the Omegas, and talk about why these organizations were created, what value they've brought to the society, and also to see some of the distinctions, because a lot of people have looked at my book and they've seen that a lot of the photos are of light complexion black folks, and they say, well, why are all the blacks light complexion? And historically, the black upper class has been light complexion because the group started from slavery, when the slave owners divided us on the plantations into the, excuse my French, the field niggers and the house niggers, and that was the term that was used, where they had the dark-skinned slaves working in the worst labor, and then the light-skinned slaves working in the quote-unquote prestige slave jobs as the mammies, the cooks, the butlers, the servants. And of course, those were the ones who were also forced to procreate with the white slave owners, thus creating more light-skinned offspring, still slaves nevertheless, but they were also the ones who got the better treatment, the better food, clothing, and also the ones who ultimately were allowed to be educated. So it was that caste system that really created the black upper class. And I guess the mistake of many members of this group was buying into this whole concept that there was a superiority based upon a lighter complexion. But that is why, when you look at the earlier classes of graduates from Howard and Spelman and Fisk and Morehouse and schools like that, as well as the early members, I mean, as you can see on the cover of the book, at a cotillion in 1952, that the 17-year-old young women who are graduating from the school, graduating and going to this cotillion in Manhattan, were light complexion women. So that is how this caste system got started. and why we have such things as the brown paper bag and ruler test, which was also an important aspect of this community. But more importantly, I'd like to go back to some of the earlier families and individuals that I talk about, and probably the most interesting one, I believe, is Madam C.J. Walker, who I know that a lot of you are familiar with because she was the first woman millionaire in this country and happened to be black. And Madam Walker made her millions in her first million in the 1890s, and then subsequently built a home in Westchester County in New York State, right down the street from the Rockefellers, a 20,000 square foot mansion that still stands today. And what's so interesting about this history is that Madam Walker's home is now owned by the Doley family, Harold Doley, who was the first black with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. And if you look at some of the pictures in the book and the pictures of this house, you'll see one picture taken in 1923 when her granddaughter was married in her home at a $60,000 wedding in 1923, where her granddaughter was married soon after she had graduated from Spelman. But what's also interesting is that Madam Walker, despite the fact that she was living a very privileged life, also had very close ties to other aspects of the black community. And what I mean when I say that is that she also recognized she had a responsibility. And she was one of the first and largest contributors to the NAACP in 1910, 1911, and 1912 in order to help establish their anti-lynching campaign. So even though she considered herself a businesswoman, she was also very much an activist. And you'll notice when you read some of the stories of these families, these old guard families, a lot of them are not activists. Some of them would very quietly give contributions, large contributions, to found colleges and scholarship programs and to support the NAACP and certain politicians, but they were not people that were on the front lines. Julian Bond was one of the unusual members of these black upper class families that actually did become activists during the civil rights period and before that time. But it really wasn't until after the late 60s and early 70s where you found members of these old families that really actually got involved. During my 6 years of researching our kind of people, I also noticed that this is a very insular group. These are folks who do not socialize outside of their own community. And when I say their own community, they don't socialize in church or in social situations or business settings outside of the people that they consider to be their kind of people. That's why when I got to different cities, I would ask them about various churches, and I found almost uniformly that in each city there was a church where the old guard black families belong to. And what's most interesting is that even though most African Americans in this country have been traditionally Baptist, this group is primarily Episcopalian and Congregationalist. So in each city there was a Congregational church and an Episcopal church. Like for instance in Washington it was always St. Luke's where this group belonged to. So, but when I travel from city to city, I would often ask individuals about some of the high-profile celebrities. So, for example, when I was in Philadelphia, I would ask people, was Bill Cosby a member of the black upper class in Philadelphia? And almost uniformly, these old families said absolutely not. He's an entertainer. So that was another aspect that I found within this group, was that they didn't like entertainers. They didn't like people who had made money through sports. They wanted people as a part of their group who had gotten money through medicine, through law, through business. So it was a very, very exclusive group, and I mean that in every sense of the word, where they were quick to exclude anyone who they felt was new. And since you folks are from the D.C. area, you know in Washington you are new, at least among this community, if you have not been here for 3 or 4 generations. So it's quite interesting how the black upper class differs from city to city. One major difference I found were the differences that the southern cities, particularly Atlanta, Nashville, and Washington, how they were distinguished from northern cities. I found in New York that if you had money, it was easy to break into the upper class, the black upper class. It was a more fluid group. New York and Los Angeles were more accepting of people who had been who had earned money in recent years, and they didn't have to necessarily be able to answer the question where their grandfather graduated from medical school. But it seemed that the stakes were much higher in cities like Washington and Atlanta, where the group held on much tighter to who they were going to allow in and who was not going to be accepted in their community. A lot of people were offended and had questions about the opening lines of this book, but I just want to read them to you. Bryant Gumbel is, but Bill Cosby isn't. Lena Horne is, but Whitney Houston isn't. Andrew Young is, but Jesse Jackson isn't. And neither is Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Clarence Thomas, or Quincy Jones. And even though both of them try extremely hard, neither Diana Ross nor Robin Givens will ever be. A lot of people ask me, where did those lines come from? Why'd you come up with something like that? And where I came up with those names was that visiting every city, when I got to Los Angeles, I would ask about some of the prominent blacks who had grown up in Los Angeles. And just as I'd done for Bill Cosby in Philadelphia. And constantly people would say things like, oh no, she's not our kind of people, or no, he's not our kind of people, because this group very firmly knew who was in and who was not. So, and they even knew who had married in and who had been born in. So as I discovered that the black upper class, as it defines itself, is not that different from how different segments of the white upper class defines itself. Who's been around a long time, who's new to the community, who earned their money in a way that we accept, and who's earned money in a way that we don't accept. So that was what was particularly interesting. What I found also in all the cities is that a lot of these millionaire families, these families that got earned their first million in the generally 1880s, 1890s. For example, the mansion that's on the cover of the book is the home of Alonzo Herndon, who was the first black millionaire in Atlanta, and he made his first million in the late 1880s. And the Herndon home, his home is still standing today, and it's now a museum in Atlanta. But he founded Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which is still in existence today. And he was very similar to a lot of the millionaires during the 1880s and 1890s, that each one of them had founded businesses that thrived primarily because of segregation. And as an example, I give you, each one of these cities had a black insurance company, a black bank, a black funeral home. There were black businesses because at that time the white banks would not loan money to black families, the white insurance companies would not insure black property, the white funeral homes would not accept black bodies. So there were certain families that were the black banking family in each city. So whether you're in Memphis or Chicago or Atlanta or Washington, there were families that had supported the black community in that way by starting these businesses. And what is also, I guess, maybe ironic is that it was actually integration that diluted some of the wealth of these families, because then ultimately there were choices for where the black community was going to spend its money, whether for banking or insurance or funeral homes or whatever the business might happen to be. So it's very similar in the way in which a lot of these families got started. Some of the distinctions that I did find from one family to the next and from one city to the next was the emphasis on this whole brown paper bag and ruler test, where you had to be lighter than a brown paper bag and your hair straighter than a ruler in order to be accepted into this group, was once again more a southern phenomenon than it was a northern issue. So when it came to, obviously we take that to its logical conclusion, you end up having racial passing, and that's why there was a particular woman up in New York who complained a lot about my book because I had outed her. And what had basically happened, and I'll just give you the background, I had written about when I was in Philadelphia and I interviewed people. I said, of all the Philadelphia families, who are some of the families that I should make sure I write about? And when I was in Philadelphia, they said, well, you've got to write about the Christmas family. They're a very prominent family. The Dr. Christmas had founded the Philadelphia chapter of the Alphas, and the black men's fraternity. And so I asked around, are there any of the Christmas descendants alive? And they said, well, yeah, Dr. Christmas's 3 kids are alive. And one was a dentist in New York today, still today. Another one was, her name is Marie Rohn. And some of you might recognize the last name Rohn, R-H-O-N-E, because Marie's daughter is Sylvia Rohn, who's the president of Elektra Records, the highest ranking black woman in the record business. So I wrote about Marie Rohn and her daughter being Sylvia Rohn. And I said, well, who else is alive from the Christmas family? And they said, well, another daughter named Alice. I said, well, what's her name now? And they said, well, her name is Alice Mason. So I wrote about Alice Mason, did some research, and I found that Alice Mason is a real estate broker in New York City, where she sells apartments valued only above $1.5 million. So that's the only clientele she has, is people that are spending $1.5 million or more on apartments. So clearly a very wealthy clientele. And I also knew that she was friends of Brooke Astor and a lot of and Barbara Walters and a lot of New York socialites. So I wrote about this in the book. But when it first came out, folks from Philadelphia called me up and they said, oh, great, Alice Mason's finally come out of the closet. And I said, well, what do you mean, come out of the closet? And they said, oh, well, I guess we neglected to tell you that she's been living as white for the last 35 years. And yeah, they had forgotten to tell me that little fact. It's unfortunately still a part of within many of these families. There are 1 or 2 cousins or uncles or aunts who've chosen to make that decision. Obviously, it was in greater number at a time when it was economically necessary. My parents had grown up in Memphis in the segregated South, and they would tell me stories of when they were shopping at Goldsmith's, which is still is a big department store, but back in the 50s, they blacks couldn't try on shoes, couldn't try on hats. So some people decided if they needed to, they would just pass in order to try on a dress or do whatever they needed to do. Or if they wanted to sit downstairs in the air-conditioned part of a movie theater or to go swimming in a particular pool. But what's important to recognize is that a lot of the organizations that came out of the black upper class were not created in order to be copies of white organizations, whether they were cotillions or organizations, social clubs like Jack and Jill. Because even though I wasn't aware of this when I was growing up in Jack and Jill in Westchester, Jack and Jill was founded as a play group, and was founded in Philadelphia as a play group because these 8 women who 7 of them were wives of physicians, 1 was a wife of a banker. They were dealing with segregation, and their kids could not go to the segregated museums, and when they traveled, they couldn't go to the segregated pools and other public facilities. So they said, well, since a couple of us have our own pools and we have ties to certain museums, we can create this play group and be able to introduce our children to culture and to the arts and sort of work outside of segregation. And that's why Jack and Jill became popular, particularly in different pockets of the South. Now, clearly, in some of these organizations, whether it was the Lynx or the Jack and Jill or the AKAs or the Alphas, whatever, obviously in those early years, there was a focus of knowing who are your grandparents, who are your parents, did you fit the right complexion, did you fit the right physical characteristic? So there clearly was that bias that had been unfortunately embraced by this community, but at the same time, all of these organizations demanded a great deal from their membership with regard to public service. That whether we're talking about sororities or fraternities, they all required their members to serve as mentors and big brothers and big sisters. So in that regard, they're also very different from white fraternities and white sororities, because most of that time and emphasis is spent on a student still in college, whereas black fraternities and black sororities, the greater emphasis is spent and what's demanded for people as once they have graduated and what they're expecting people to give back. I think I'm gonna stop there because I've given you a sense of some of the issues that I've dealt with in our kind of people, and also the role in which this group has played in the larger black community, because it's been for many, many generations a very, very separate, hidden community. I do have to say that in recent years, many members are becoming more activist, more politically active, and I myself right now am finding that out firsthand because I'm right now considering launching a congressional race in New York. And as I'm doing that, I'm getting a lot of calls from people who belong to these organizations, like the Boule, like the Links, and finding out that people like your former mayor, Sharon Pratt Dixon, who had grown up in Washington in one of these old guard families, gone to Howard and grew up in Jack and Jill, belongs to the Links, that I'm finding out that this also serves as an important network that really should be helping the larger black community, not just as a social network, but also as a professional network and as a political network. So there are advantages that should be taken to help the larger black community. But before I close and open up for questions, I just want to say that even though a lot of people were disturbed by the whole notion of talking about class within the black community, I think we have to be honest about the fact that just like the Jewish community or the Irish community or the Italian community, we include class as a way of talking about where we come from. And I don't mean class in a sense of being superior to one another, but having different experiences, whether it's because of education, whether it's because of money, whether it's because of what we're introduced to. And I think it's more human nature than it is racially driven. And I think that, that all groups still have a class structure. So I'd like to open up for questions or comments that anyone might have. Yes?
Good evening. Very pleased to meet you. Very glad that you're here.
Thank you.
I am a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and I feel that you portrayed us in a very positive light in your book. But for those other sororities that may not really exist, have you gotten any negative feedback from them saying that they were disappointed in the way that they were portrayed in your book?
Okay, the AKAs, your sorority, the AKAs and the Deltas are the oldest of the two sororities. Let's just take the two sororities. I haven't gotten negative feedback from other sororities or other sorority members. What I have gotten was the question of, like, why wasn't there more said about those other sororities? And a lot of it had to do with when I traveled around during the 6 years interviewing these families, just asking them simply, what are the sororities you belong to? And the two that constantly came up were the AKAs and the Deltas. And I think also because their histories were older, and as you probably know about this old rivalry between the two, where the demands on who had the greater grade point average and, you know, who was the first of their class, particularly at Howard, since that's where they were founded, that was more the reason why they played a greater role. And also in looking at some of the most prominent families, for whatever reason, they had selected those two sororities for their daughters, or their daughters selected them for themselves. Yes?
Good evening. I'm Roosevelt McMillan. I represent Alpha Theta Fraternity Incorporated. I noticed that on page 89, you stated that there were 8 organizations with National Panhellenic Council. I just wanted to say that our fraternity was founded in 1963. We've been serving the black community for over 30 years. And we were inducted into the National Panhellenic Council in 1996. And we have a number of notable persons who are representing the fraternity, such as Christian Spencer, formerly of Good Morning America, and Congressman Bobby Rush of Illinois. So I was wondering that since you published this book in 1998, what's with the omission?
I have to tell you, I relied on their numbers that they gave me probably in 95 or 96. I'm sorry if I obviously did omit your fraternity, and I apologize for that. But I'll know that for the next edition. I appreciate it. Thank you. Other comments or questions? You know, it's funny, interesting, I'm glad that the two of you have mentioned your involvement in sororities and fraternities. I don't know if the larger black community or the larger American community is aware of how active the fraternities and sororities are outside of the college campuses. I think when people think of fraternities and sororities, they typically think of their activities limited to the campus and not really aware of the kinds of scholarship money and fundraising that they perform, and also the kind of responsibility of requiring members to say, you are expected to give X number of hours every month or every year to act serving as a big brother or a big sister. And I would probably say of all of the organizations that the black upper class has embraced, I would say that the fraternities and sororities are probably the ones that have done the most with regard to reaching outside of the black elite community. And I think that's probably serves as a good model for some of the other organizations who've not yet reached out to do that. And obviously it's evident, I think these groups are also much more fluid, because to get into them, you don't have to be the son or the granddaughter of a former member, although I've been told it helps. Comment or question? Yes.
Charles LaRoche, I know that the Boule is typically a closed social group that I would characterize maybe somewhat secretive. How do they react to you exposing them, discussing their being and their principles in your book?
Okay, Sigma Pi Phi Boule, which was founded at the turn of the century, was founded as a secret organization. It actually opened up once it started a Boule Foundation in the late 70s and early 80s. Is no longer a secret organization. I should give a little bit of background about about the group. It's a black men's fraternity that is. It's not a college fraternity. It's different from your fraternity and the other fraternities we were talking about. But it's a fraternity that is joined, that adult men join as once they are out in the real world as professionals or whatever they're doing. And it happens to have, I don't know, my guess is it's probably the largest percentage of black mayors and black politicians and professionals. There are non-blacks, there are white members of the organization, and there are chapters in virtually every city, but it, like Jack and Jill and the Lynx, was founded in Philadelphia. But some of the old guard said this used to be a secret organization, we're not anymore, and they acknowledge that. But I think for the most part, a lot of them have responded positively that they're also doing things in the community, because people perceive them as a group of lawyers or judges or physicians who dressed up in black tie and just spend a lot of money, when in fact they raise a lot of money and give a lot for scholarships and other programs. So unlike the Lynx, which was always a very public organization, the Black Women's Organization founded in 1946, have made a transition. Yes.
My name's Trevor. Just by listening to you, I have a question. With considering the borders that are between middle class and we're going to say lower class, do you believe that that's a positive thing? Because to me, it seems that once you start classifying and separating, I understand that if you had a town that had a black insurance company, it was necessary back then. But this is the year 2000, and we have everything they have, and they have everything we have. And
well, I think that to get into
damaging?
Well, of course it can be damaging, absolutely, and I think it has been. It's been divisive. But I'm saying for us to ignore the existence of the class structure would be to ignore part of our history. I'm sure. I mean, you're much younger than I am, but I remember when I was growing up, we grew up where, I mean, there were very few blacks on television. And the sitcoms that we did have, you probably maybe from reruns, you would know a show, Good Times. But I mean, I grew up with shows like Good Times, Sanford and Son, and this was after Julia. And actually, Julia had been criticized by a lot of black folks that said, oh, you know, she dresses too well, she speaks too correctly. And because we had bought into this notion that if you were black in America, you had a certain economic status, you spoke in a certain way, you afforded certain things, you had certain interests, and we were ready to buy into, because the larger media population was telling us, okay, Good Times is the authentic black family. I didn't know people like JJ when I was growing up, and I had plenty of black friends that I, whether from Jack and Jill or the NAACP, from church or whatever, but there was no Kid Dynamite, but yet the media was telling me this is what a black teenager, a black adolescent is like. So what I'm saying is that we cannot allow American history to be told in the terms of, well, this is the one role that black people have played. And so whether we like the fact, I mean, of course, in this group, in this book, there are plenty of snobs, no question about it. There are plenty of elitists that want nothing to do with middle-class people, want nothing to do with poor people. They want nothing to do with wealthy white people. They live a very, very insular life. But at the same time, I'm saying that it's a history that still has to be talked about. But I agree with you, it can be extremely divisive, without a doubt, especially if these individuals don't take advantage of what they can do for other people, because they're in the unusual role of making powerful, whether it's hiring decisions or influencing other people's hiring decisions. So they do have that responsibility. Absolutely. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Did I hear you right? You said that you're running for Congress?
I'm not announced yet. I have a campaign manager and have raised money towards running for Congress, but I'm expecting to probably announce very soon.
Which district?
It's in New York, 19th Congressional District in New York. It's Westchester County. And if I win, if I run and win, the Clintons will be in my district because they live 7 blocks away from us in Chappaqua. So any other, yes?
When talking about classism in the black community, how much of an impact do you think skin color still plays? Like when you talk about, historically speaking, about the blue vein societies and then the brown paper bag rule, how much do you think does it play now?
Still today, and I know that even during the research of this book, and like I said, it was 6 years, so there was a gap there, but there were people that would not talk to me, would not allow me in their homes because I did not look like what they wanted me to look like. And they felt that I wouldn't understand the black upper class because I did not look like the black upper class. And so I can tell you, and that happened in Washington. I mean, it wasn't someplace else. I mean, it was in Washington, it happened in Atlanta. It sounds like you know what I'm talking about. So even today, I don't think it's prevalent around so many young people, but I still think today there are generations, our parents, our grandparents, who truly believe that they don't want their children dating people that are darker than that brown paper bag. And it's unfortunate that there are still people today like that. And I mean, I grew up with a great-grandmother who would, when she would visit us in Martha's Vineyard, would yell at my brother and me to stay out of the sun, saying we're dark enough already. And you grew up with, where are you from?
I'm from Maryland, and my father told me not to bring home. He had to be yellow, white, or damn near white. Those were his words, because I was the darkest one in the family.
Sure.
So I know all about that.
And you know how personally damaging that is, because it becomes obviously people look at their self-worth at some point, but I think the civil rights movement did change that to a great extent. I think it changed it a lot. But I also think that the Northeast and the West Coast have gotten away from it much more than the South has. I think in the South you find more of that, not as much certainly as you did before. Yes.
I'm particularly concerned with the lack of black leadership in the black community. And do you believe that the expansion of the black upper class has to some degree thwarted that expansion of black leadership within the black community, and that plays a particular role in the lack of leadership today?
Excellent question. I think that in the past, the black elites focus on exclusionary policies has been damaging with regard to producing more leaders. Because if this truly is an elite, they should also be the intellectual elite, the elite that should be inspiring, intending to inspire other people towards greatness. And also, their focus should be towards giving something back, making the community around them, even if they don't live in it and interact in it, but making it better than it was. I think that, and I talked to Julian Bond's mom about this when I was in Atlanta, where she said that there were people that knew the Bonds very well, and when Julian decided to go into politics, said, "Oh, we don't do that. You know, your grandfather was a college president. You know, become a doctor, become a lawyer, do anything. We don't want to be activists." And I think he saw something that was really necessary, and it's ironic. Many people don't realize that there are many prominent leaders who have been, for example, Martin Luther King was a member of the Boule for a short time. His wife was a member of the Lynx for a time. There were people in Atlanta who were Lynx who felt very uncomfortable about the idea of Coretta Scott King's husband being arrested. And they thought, well, this doesn't look good. Even if it is for the cause of integration, it just doesn't look good for us. And there were many people who I grew up. When I was growing up in Westchester, Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's widow, who's now deceased, her kids were in my Jack and Jill chapter. A lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people think that that many of the offspring of some of the activists have nothing to do with these organizations, when in fact they are deeply rooted in it. Their daughter went to Princeton with me, and Betty was in my Mother's Links chapter. So you actually do find pockets of these families and these activist families who are involved in these organizations today. That wasn't so. It was frowned upon in the 50s and the 60s, but I think fortunately the civil rights movement changed that. So I think that as this group becomes more inclusive, and they have, because of your generation being more open-minded about this, because it's also opened up the Caribbean community, which was originally refused the opportunity to become a part of these organizations, these cotillions and these various groups, which that's now changed mainly because of your generation and not because of our parents' generation. Yes.
Do you feel, since you're going, like you said, if you run and if you win, what kind of steps are you planning on taking, if you can, to kind of like bridge the gap between, because it seems to me that there sounds like some form of gap.
I think there's a lot that can be done to bridge the gap. At the very least, there are a lot of people that say, I don't consider myself as a spokesperson, I don't consider myself as a leader. But one does not have to be an elected official, one does not have to be the head of an organization in order to provide leadership or provide mentoring. I mean, there's simple things, and I keep going back to the example of what the fraternities and sororities do, where they make it possible, and people can do this through churches, people can do this through neighborhood organizations, adopting somebody, adopting a child, and I don't mean like physically adopting a foster child, but I'm saying adopting someone, saying, I'm going to take this person to my place of business. Maybe they're a banker, maybe they're a physician. There are 10-year-old black children who've never been inside of an office building, who don't know what it's like to be a banker or what it's like to visit a college campus. To adopt them in those ways, to encourage people and say, look at the impact you can have on young people, because I think that is the biggest difference that the black upper class can make, is reaching outside their community in situations to the local schools and churches like that. I think I'm going to close now and sign books, and happy to answer any individual questions that you might have. But I want to thank Caribou Books for inviting me tonight, and I want to thank all of you for coming out here in D.C. and Maryland to join me in this. Thank you.